Adda is a site in South Asia for a free exchange of ideas.
This is going to cost you.
Often over a cup of tea, which we shall provide after the discussion is over. I'm Ashutosh Varshney, Director of the Center for Contemporary South Asia. Welcome also to those who are watching on YouTube, wherever you are. To put it in grandest political terms, this book occupies the ground between Max Weber and Thomas Hobbes. Let me explain. Modern state, said Weber, is supposed to have a monopoly over legitimate coercion or monopoly over instruments of violence against citizens. But in the real world, this monopoly is quite often challenged by armed non-state groups. While the life of an ordinary citizen everywhere in the territory might not be nasty, poor, brutish, and short, it can be precisely those things in some parts of a legally constituted territory. So how do modern states deal with armed non-state groups? Why do they crush them when they do? Why do they accommodate them when they do? And why do they sometimes seek an alliance with them? These are the questions at the heart of this new book, very recently published, Ordering Violence, by Paul Staniland. Paul, I think it's his third or fourth visit to Brown, and we are very pleased to be the object of his affection. He will speak for 15 minutes or so, introducing the main themes and arguments of his book and the materials that especially come from South Asia. And then we will have our discussants. We have 4 discussants. I'll introduce them, introduce each by turn. So over to you, Paul. Paul Staniland is an associate professor of political science at the University of Chicago, and this is his second book.
Great. So first of all, I want to say thank you to Ashu for this incredibly generous invitation, but also especially to the discussants who have come from various faraway places, or at least, a train ride in the case of the Cambridge people. I'm really, really very grateful. To be honest, I kind of hate talking about my own published work. So what I decided to do, because it's kind of like, yeah, there are a lot of problems, I can't do anything about them. Here we are, right? But I wanted to pull out some what I hope are kind of big themes that are of potential interest across both in South Asia and more broadly, to kind of maybe get us thinking about directions as well as conclusions, right? That's kind of the hope here. So I've timed myself, so hopefully I won't ramble too extensively. And I'm just gonna start off with kind of the basic question or questions. We can observe, just looking around the world, that armed groups of various kinds, armed political parties, rioters, militias, self-styled insurgents, private armies, warlords, whatever you want to call them, have a remarkably broad range of political relationships with central governments. As Ashu said, sometimes they work closely together. This is perhaps the stereotypical image of a pro-state militia or of the armed wing of a ruling political party. Sometimes they fight intensely against them, as in our prototypical view of a insurgent, counterinsurgent war. Often they live in between. So think about the American government's relationship with right-wing violence in the US. Kind of oscillates up and down from something like toleration with limited repression to more intense crackdowns to kind of a return to a world of containment and kind of, keeping a lid on things, right? And so the project is interested in trying to first help us think about what those relationships are. What are these cases of? How can we compare them? How can we conceptualize them? How can we measure them? And then second, how might we help to try to explain variation in them? And this book has a very limited aim in certain ways. It's not a grand explanation of everything. There's a million moving parts in the world. But it's aiming to offer a simplifying, but hopefully usefully simplifying, kind of theoretical framework to help us make sense of some of this variation, while also acknowledging where it doesn't help us, and the domains in which kind of I don't necessarily have a lot to say, which I think suggests a lot of interesting research directions. So the starting point, or kind of a way of answering this first question, is by shifting our focus to an outcome of interest that I call armed orders. The original title of the book was going to be Armed Politics, and then the press said that won't sell enough copies, so it's been changed, for better or worse. But thinking about how might we systematically, in a social scientific way, think about this range of relations between regimes and armed actors. Now, people in this group, except for Vipin, have studied this topic with enormous care and have already offered ways of thinking about it. And so what this book does is it tries to build on decades of literature and tries to put different pieces of work kind of in this spectrum, right? So I identify basically 4 primary armed orders. Alliances that kind of sound like what they are, right? Close coordination of policy by a state and an armed group towards some shared goal. Kind of on one end of the spectrum, this is fairly tight, close coordination. So we can think of, for instance, during the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq, the pushback involved close coordination between a variety of militia forces, both Shia and Kurdish, with American and Central Iraqi forces, right? Kind of an alliance against the Islamic State. We can then move to a middle category that I call here, and it's not the world's catchiest title, I know, but limited cooperation, which is what it sounds like. A world of live and let live deals, of bargains, of understandings, whether formal or informal, that try to limit that try to reduce or even eliminate mutual conflict, mutual violence. So an interesting example of this is in northern Myanmar. There's a group called United Wa State Army. It has up to 20,000 men under arms. It's existed since the collapse of the Communist Party of Burma in 1989, and it basically has never fought the central state since it broke away from the Communist Party of Burma. What does it do? It sits there, right? It has a deal, a ceasefire with the Myanmar government that has held even as the rest of the country has seen re-escalated conflict. It controls territory. The Myanmar military doesn't go into that territory. There's no peace deal. The armed group doesn't work for the state. There's no formal peace talks about anything. It's kind of a classic live and let live order. We can see variants of this also, for instance, in northeastern India with various Naga factions over the decades. The MQM in Karachi at various points, the armed political party in Karachi, had live and let live deals as well as alliances and various kinds of wars with the military and central regime. So this is actually a big, important in-between category. And then we see various kinds of war, right? More intense, what I call total wars, less intense, what I call containment orders, okay? And so this helps us understand kind of variation in the nature of conflict and cooperation. And I think we can take this, even if you don't buy anything else from the rest of this presentation, I think this is something that we can work with as social scientists and take to all kinds of contexts, whether it's crackdowns on trade unions or dissidents or whatever the topic is, kind of a more fine-grained spectrum that we can see and compare. And these can end in a variety of ways. The main focus on the project is on when groups collapse. And as I'll show in a slide or two, that's the primary way that groups end, is they're defeated, they fall apart. Sometimes they're incorporated, whether formally, right, through a peace settlement, or informally. So one of the interesting dynamics in South Asia, and I'm sure elsewhere, is the creation of kind of these nebulous armed wings of ruling parties. Sometimes, they're student wings. It's like 37-year-olds who are part of the student wing. But in any case, often these are kind of local specialists in violence that are absorbed or sucked into a ruling party or a mainstream political party. This can be a form of incorporation without demobilization, reintegration type formal peace deals. We also found some others going through data. Some groups are absorbed into others. Some just put their guns down, which we did not expect to find. We call this disarmament. I can talk about Tamil armed paramilitaries in Sri Lanka after 2009. They just stop using violence, but they don't demobilize or anything. And then very occasionally, in this context, armed groups achieve their stated war aims if they're insurgents. There are very few of these cases, though in the broader world, there are obviously more. So part of the book is with many caveats and all kinds of hopefully maybe excessive transparency and limitations, right? I had a research group that went through a whole variety of armed groups, approximately 200 armed groups, over hopefully the course of their existence. And for each year measured which of these armed orders they were in with a central government. For the Indian cases, I was also able to do some subnational state level dynamics here in places like Kerala and West Bengal, though those are hazier. And so one thing it lets us do is just very simply see that a lot of the action is in these kind of gray middle spaces of limited cooperation and containment, right? Actually, my last slide shows, neither Weber nor Hobbes, right? So Ashu read my mind, right? Of course, there is a world of war of all against all here, right? There are intense, brutal civil wars of state breakdown, the kind of dynamics Fotini has written so eloquently about in places like Afghanistan or early mid-1990s Bosnia. There are also the places in which the state is controlling violence, even if it's non-state violence, right? These are alliances in which usually the state has the upper hand. But much of the world is in between, kind of negotiations over the use of violence. Often we don't actually observe violence in these contexts, right? That's what limited cooperation often is. So we don't want to just look at the ones in our Civil War data sets. We also want to really carefully think about the zeros, the places that don't look like they have war, but are also not really contexts of peace or like a stable, legitimate monopoly of violence.
Is this the whole world and over what time?
Oh gosh, I'm sorry. This is 4 countries since 1947. This is India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Burma, Myanmar. I also have some data from Bangladesh and Nepal that are not in the book. Maybe it would have been hilarious if I was like, yes, this goes back to 1789, a global data set. But no, not at all. I'm happy to talk about kind of more about where the data came from and all the limits to it. But it's a way of seeing these things and showing how do they end. Mostly groups collapse. One of the big takeaways here is it's really hard to be a non-state armed group. If you're going to die, or I'm sorry, if you're going to end, it's usually the group just can't hold itself together. Right? Victory is extremely rare in this context, the South Asian context. In global data, the same is true. Insurgents usually lose. But there are all these interesting incorporation, absorption, disarmament that are between them kind of summing up to about a third of cases. We can also see change over time, right? So this is, for each year, the distribution of armed orders in Burma or Myanmar. So of all the armed orders in a year, kind of what percentage of them are basically the darker is the more conflictual. It doesn't show up great here. The crosshatched or lighter is more cooperative. And so a nice thing here is we can see these big understood qualitative macro-historical changes in the political economy of conflict in Myanmar. The rise of Ne Win's military dictatorship in 1962 leads to a massive increase in really intense repression across the country. Ne Win's death in 1988 and the rise of a set of ceasefires along the Burmese periphery we can also see in the data. So there are huge problems with the data, but also I think it's capturing kind of a way of understanding what's happening in these countries that aligns with our kind of qualitative common sense understanding. Right? It lets us look at things like cooperation and conflict. This is in Pakistan with Islamist and non-Islamist actors. We see there's a lot more cooperation with self-described Islamists than with non-Islamists. I can talk more about this as we go on. And so this gives at least a flavor of what this mixture of qualitative and quantitative research might help us see, right? Questions it can open, maybe questions it can help us answer. So what's the argument then? How might we think about what's driving some of this variation? And so kind of one maybe excessively snarky way of putting it is that part of this project is to try to bring politics back into the study of political violence. To kind of denaturalize what we take for granted assumptions, denaturalize taken for granted assumptions about what states and governments want and what they fear. And I think there is an understandable tendency in the literature to kind of say governments want X and they fear Y. Right? For instance, Barbara Walter has a wonderful book about separatist groups that makes extremely strong claims about how governments view separatist groups. And I think there's much more variation in what governments are worried about and the kinds of actors that they actually view as unproblematic, unthreatening, or somewhere in between than the Civil War literature has really kind of taken seriously. So the argument I make is that regimes' ideological projects, which are mostly generally about nationalism, though not exclusively, like we can talk about the Soviet Union in the late 1910s and early 1920s, right? Let's call it the polity, the kind of the boundaries of the polity and hierarchies within it, right? Regimes have these visions, and then threats are in relation to whatever their ideological project is, right? Which is going to generate massive variation in what governments want and what they're worried about, right? It really matters if you have Barack Obama in power, compared to Pol Pot, for instance, right? There's then a part of the book I'm not going to delve into, which is more about kind of nitty-gritty tactical stuff. It's not as big picture interesting, I think, but I'm happy to talk about it. And I mostly focus on regimes that are relatively coherent. I focus primarily on central government interactions with armed groups, and I mostly focus on armed actors. I think the framework might have some traction beyond these domains, but kind of for the purpose of the book, I kept it much more tightly scoped. So what I try to do in the project is historicize these threat perceptions by looking at the emergence of what I kind of drawing on people like Sherry Berman call these carrier movements that generate ideas of politics prior to taking power. So this lets us identify these understandings of, for instance, nationalism or religious citizenship prior to a seizure of power, prior to a movement becoming a regime, to look for kind of an ex-ante set of indicators of what a future government may view as a threat or as unproblematic, right? And these carrier movements are diverse, various different backgrounds, right? And so what I then argue is you can get these different alignments of armed groups with relation to the political cleavages and political symbols that governments care most deeply about. And that's what threat is about. It's not just about the number of men under arms. It's not just about the objective military strength of armed groups, but instead the relationship of those groups and their demands to these core ideological goals, that regimes carry with them. And I think this helps us understand patterns of repression that seem wildly disproportionate to the objective military threat being posed by some scattered group of dissidents or intellectuals, as well as cases in which large militias or armed actors are basically left alone by governments or worked with, right, in which private violence is seen as politically unproblematic, rather than like a fundamental threat to the Weberian legitimate monopoly of violence. So what I do in the book is that I kind of generate, I love typologies, I don't know, for better and worse, they're like my love language, right? And so you can think about different armed groups falling into these different combinations of ideological alignment with kind of basically, are they useful to the government and willing to play ball with the government to pursue some more discrete tactical goals, winning elections, winning counterinsurgencies, projecting power across borders. So we get like dynamics like these armed allies or mortal enemies that kind of make sense, right? They're what you would expect. Mortal enemies are like the world of classical counterinsurgency. These are the insurgents to be defeated by the regime. Armed allies are what you might think of as your classic pro-state militias or armed political parties. But then we get a lot of groups that are kind of in between, right? Groups that are ideologically aligned but can't really do anything for the government and so kind of get sucked up into the ruling apparatus or mainstream politics. Some groups, this is like Fotini Christia world, where they may be ideologically opposed, but they have tactical reasons to work together, right? These strange bedfellows, right? So you can see these kind of curious alliances that cut across in some, I think, somewhat rare but very important conditions, these ideological cleavages. And a lot of groups that live in what I call here this gray zone, where they're leveraging demands, making demands that could be manageable within mainstream politics, but are kind of more extreme along some dimension than the regime would prefer. Let's call these kind of unsavory but tolerable actors that sometimes are useful and willing to do business, and sometimes are just kind of to be contained. I think of right-wing militias in the US as traditionally following into this like undesirable category. Like, yeah, the regime thinks, yeah, they're kind of problematic. The Trump administration maybe doesn't view them as problematic at all, which makes a broader point about ideology and threat perception. But kind of this world of actors that don't need to be destroyed. It's not worth the hassle, right? So I'm running low on time, but I wanted to give the crudest possible sketch, right? There's way more in there. You can love it or hate it, but there's way more in the book, where I try to put this kind of argument in motion, looking at regimes that have taken power in post-colonial South Asia, emerging in some form out of British colonialism. And I focus here on India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Burma, or Myanmar. I'm happy to talk about Nepal and Bangladesh, especially Bangladesh a little bit if people are interested, but it's kind of a result of one of these rather than starting from this colonial starting point. And so the very broad, crude argument I make is that, and this is, I think, not a shocking or controversial statement, the ideological projects of India and Pakistan come from different places and lead to different sets of fears, right? And so basically what you see both in the articulation of leaders and then also systematically in data on patterns of accommodation and repression are what I think of as kind of mirror image internal security postures, right? Tactically, they operate very similarly. These are militaries and internal security apparatuses that on the ground are doing a lot of the same stuff. But it's where they're directed toward higher or lower levels of repression that differs dramatically, right? So in India, kind of what we might think of as ethno-linguistic or tribal regionalist groups, there are a huge variety of mechanisms for managing them. You see lots of ceasefires, lots of containment, lots of live and let live dynamics. Those exact same types of group in Pakistan have been subjected to drastically higher levels of intense repression. And I link this to the kind of fears of founding elites about the greatest threats to their projects, right? In India, it's basically the fear of kind of partition anew, right? Minority religious separatism breaking apart the new nation. In Pakistan, it's this problem the Muslim League struggled with for decades, how to manage linguistic and regional difference, right? That was the key threat. And these carry over. There's much more complexity I get into, especially around Islamization in Pakistan. I talk a little bit about the rise of Hindu nationalism in India. I'd be happy to talk more about that. I actually don't think it has huge implications for most Indian counterinsurgency policies, but it has huge implications for other forms of violence. Okay. Sri Lanka and Burma, Myanmar, happy to talk about, but these are your classic sons of the soil wars from below. Kind of social movements emerge from below, demanding majoritarian kind of ethno-linguistic dominance that leads to a series of incredibly costly, objectively, often really counterproductive crackdowns and protracted counterinsurgencies that are all about boundaries of the polity, right? Are the Rohingya part of the Burmese nation or not? And then hierarchies within it. Are Tamils equal in Sri Lanka, or in fact they guests who need to be on their best behavior, right? Because the Sinhalese Buddhists dominate, they own the land, right? So these are what these wars are actually about. Okay, so I'm gonna end here. As Ashu stole my thunder, right? He said I was between Weber and Hobbes. I'm gonna say it's neither Weber nor Hobbes, but they're basically the same thing, right? Political life, including in rich, fancy countries, is in fact often a world of bargaining, tacit coexistence, right? And various kinds of more and less conflictual and cooperative relations between regimes and various kinds of armed actors, right? To understand these, I think we need to take seriously the ways in which mainstream politics are historically constructed and, in fact, garrisoned by large internal security apparatuses. What seems normal and taken for granted in one place may be very different in another. Third, I think there's a case here for integrating the study of political violence beyond kind of silos of like civil war, state building, electoral violence. They're all, and sometimes, all about the same basic fundamental questions. And then finally, if we want to talk more about kind of policy implications, I think this suggests a variety of options for building something like stability or something like sustainable political order that are not just about kind of creating Leviathan, which I think under some circumstances actually leads to very counterproductive consequences. So that's a rough sketch of the project. I'm very grateful to all of you who are here today, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Planning to go first.
You want to go first?
Yeah, so you know.
So our first commentator is Fotini Christia from MIT. She's the Ford International Professor in the Social Sciences at the Department of Political Science and director of this is a new center, this was not there when I was a student there, director of the Socio-Technical Systems Research Center, SSRC.
The internet didn't exist when you were.
Yeah, correct. Associate Director of the Institute for Data Systems and Society and Chair of the Doctoral Program in Social and Engineering Systems. That, I think, did exist, SES, yeah. Fotini is the author of Alliance Formation and Civil War, a very important book which was published in 2012 by Cambridge and was awarded the Lubert Prize for Best Book in Comparative Politics. So I won that too. But I didn't win the other two she won. She won Lep Gold Prize for Best Book in International Relations. I didn't. And a Distinguished Book Award from the International Studies Association, ISA. I didn't. All right. Her research has also appeared in Science, Review of Economic Studies, APSR, and the Annual Review of Political Science. And like some other political scientists, academic political scientists, including me, she has often published opinion pieces in newspapers, New York Times and Washington Post included, as well as several in Foreign Affairs. Fotini.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Ashu is always very generous with his introductions. I mean, Paul, I'm sure you're feeling flattered to be between Weber and Hobbes, or neither Weber nor Hobbes. But I should say that I'm actually truly honored and delighted to be here. It's been such a long time since we've been kind of in person, and it's great that we're convening over such a terrific book. I was just saying to Paul that this is the type of book where, for people like me, where I've written only one, it actually makes me jealous that he has two and the second is better than the first. So it was really an exciting time reading this. And Paul did a great job, obviously, giving us an overview of the motivation and the argument and where do we go from here, both academically and in terms of thinking about policy. I have known Paul for over 15 years now, so I wanted to give a little bit of context for the book in the sense of suggesting where it fits in the subfield of conflict and civil war, but also raise some questions for discussion and through this, I mean, kind of cast a little bit of light over your development as a scholar, Paul, referencing that great first book and how I think it relates to this one, actually. And also these great, terrific thoughts about where the field is going. And actually, there has definitely been a saturation in Civil War studies, some incredible work, but really thinking of how to move beyond that. And I think Paul has raised some terrific ideas in the book that I'm hoping we'll discuss more in the Q&A time as well. So Paul is definitely a celebrity scholar in the conflict processes circuit, and he's been known for being methodologically eclectic, very prolific, and has a superb area expertise on South Asia. And he's been known since his graduate student days. I've known him since then, obviously, for his very well-theorized typology-based work on violence broadly defined, with intricately woven, encyclopedically detailed empirics. I mean, his empirics are unparalleled in that regard. So obviously, he's all his work features very prominently in my syllabus, and I know it does in syllabi in top institutions across the country and the world. But what I really enjoy in terms of assigning Paul's work is not just the engagement it elicits in class and in graduate student seminars, but also seeing how it has really become agenda setting and how many of our great students at MIT have been directly influenced and have gone on to do great work that has been inspired by Paul's work. And actually, I'll raise a few of these works in my comments as well to get your reactions, Paul, on possible connections. So, in terms of the broader context of Paul's work in the Civil War and conflict literature, I mean, a lot of people in the room are very young, but luckily Ashu and Paul and I can remember how the Civil War studies subfield came about right after the end of the Cold War, and how initially everybody was drawing from international relations paradigms and theories and the security dilemma or the commitment problem, and trying to understand how civil conflicts come about and their processes and dynamics through that lens. And in that context, we all tended to view warring groups as unified actors. We saw there was a black box in terms of their identity, structure, motivation. I mean, we relied a lot on kind of exogeneity as being the driving force. And then 10 years later, we had this kind of really forceful corrective from Stathis Kalivas in his book on Logic of Violence, which basically took us on a super micro scale and tried to show how endogenously driven are a lot of these conflict dynamics on the ground. So he tried to emphasize the wartime cleavages, how we should be understanding the different sides and what are their driving motivations and what compels them to do what they do. And 10 years after Stathis' work came Paul's work, his first book, which in my mind tried to establish where the endogenous ends and where the exogenous begins. And that's what I really appreciated. So basically, Stathis took us in the weeds, and there was a lot of this celebration of endogeneity, but Paul suggested, let's take a step back and try to understand what are exogenous factors that we could be leveraging that still matter. And in his first book, that was obviously the pre-war networks. And that book, for those of you who may not be intricately familiar, it's entitled Networks of Rebellion, Explaining Insurgent Cohesion and Collapse, also by Cornell University Press. And it's basically a theory of rebel groups born from pre-war networks and how they act as focal points for mobilization, information, and trust. And Paul makes a very compelling case about the importance and role of these pre-war networks in how these dynamics played out. I was actually a reviewer on a round table that showered praise on that first book as well. But I should say that the second book I found very mature, very lucidly written. I really appreciated the way it conceptualized the state-armed group relationships as armed orders. I've been a huge fan of the perspectives piece that came a few years ago that I felt was really kind of the initial idea behind this piece. And Paul, I should say it's probably my favorite perspectives piece. And I know you've been writing a lot of those, so this has been really exceptional, and I think it's exciting to see how it drove this whole book project basically single-handedly. As Paul already explained, this current book systematically compares state-group interactions during periods of high, low, or non-existent violence across different types of groups. Political parties, militias, private armies, insurgents. He does so systematically, but also gives us an overtime dimension, which I thought was really important. So we also see the dynamic aspect of this relationship. And where the exogenous meets the endogenous here is really in ideology. So that's where the core focus of the work. And for someone like me, where I completely discounted ideology in my work and thrived in endogeneity as well. And I appreciated kind of tactical maneuvers and the importance of power dynamics and all that. I actually really appreciated how clean this argument was and the heuristic power of trying to understand how much you can leverage from ideology. And this is not that it's not that Paul discounts tactical dynamics or says that they don't matter or anything of the sort, but I think he is trying to understand how far can we go by focusing on ideology and trying to bring politics back into this conflict discussion. And he proves in the book that you can actually go quite far. And I really appreciated that. And as I said, someone coming from a very different perspective also appreciated the clarity in his definition of scope conditions and what it takes to be a state in this context, and how much control you need to have over your ideological narrative, and how much power you need to have even if you don't have monopoly, obviously. So as Paul kind of alluded that toward the closing of his remarks about the importance of thinking where we move next and where we go next, and this idea about understanding where the politics fits into the conflict context, it was really resonated with me in trying to think of where we take the work next in terms of agenda setting for our students. And maybe this is, for us comparativists working in this space is an extra reason to try to think about where the politics is in this. And what's nice about this is not only that Paul looks at this as a system where he accounts for onset, process, termination, which, the full picture is there, but also, as I said, takes the dynamic aspect and the overtime aspect really seriously. So I think the two main objectives that he sets out to accomplish, to highlight the important variation in armed orders and to take regime ideology seriously, I think he definitely does. And I for instance, coming into this as a skeptic was definitely convinced. What in terms of kind of the general questions that I want to push Paul on is trying to think a little bit more about the tactical, unsurprisingly, and exactly how he understands how ideology informs these tactical decisions, and again how this interaction works, and moving beyond this exogenous endogenous theme that I keep coming back to. How do we understand where the micro meets the macro in your theorizing as well? Because I think this is the other kind of level where the Civil War works have really tried to connect and be in dialogue with. And even though you kind of suggested that this is not the most parsimonious of theories, it definitely overcompensates in richness and explanatory power. I think we would all agree. So it's very hard. It's hard to take issue with the synthetic aspects of this work, and so no real kind of comments there or issues with that aspect of the work. But I would like to hear a little bit more about how it travels beyond your encyclopedic and really thorough cases, both in terms of regionally how it travels, but also in terms of scope how it travels. So not just let's think about it outside South Asia, but also how do we think about it in weak or fragmented states, or can we think about this in that context as well? The other point that I think you make really compellingly, and I'm almost at the end here, is thinking about how to move beyond the dyads and kind of the networks of interaction. And I really appreciate that, this importance of thinking about networks. And people have done this very differently, from like Roger Peterson doing this on a very micro level scale in terms of how he thought about networks in his conflict context. Others thinking about this in some sort of agent-based modeling way. But I'm keen to hear from you, Paul, like how do we really think about networks in this context, and what is the right level of analysis here for a network, and also what opportunities does it open for us in terms of data collection? I know you've now doing some work on Twitter, and I have been thinking about things in different ways, and a lot of this data is networked. So I wonder to what degree you have some thoughts on what this idea of not thinking about just the state versus the opposing actor, but really thinking about networks. And this is definitely a step forward, because it's not that we've only thought about it, the state versus the other actor. Some have tried to think about this in a multi-actor setting, but still not in a networked context. I also wanted to hear a little bit more about how you think the work connects with work like Anna Arjona's on rebelocracies, or some of Phil Martin's work. In generally, what you think the ecosystem of work is in this space. I think you're definitely at the core of that ecosystem, but just also understanding what other aspects of work have evolved, maybe Isla's work or other people's work. I would really enjoy that as well. And I just want to close by saying that where do we go from here in terms of research on political violence? Any thoughts on that I think would be really helpful. I start teaching my civil war class by telling everyone there's so much to learn here, but there's no low-hanging fruit, and it's such a saturated space. So this is kind of the big caveat. Great work and tons to learn from, but where do we kind of move from here? Thanks very much, everyone.
So, our next commentator, I would also be very curious to know how the foundational argument about ideology connects with the micro. Yeah, ever since Tathis Kelivas wrote that, it's just, it would be nice to know how to connect. Yeah. Okay. Our second commentator is a former graduate of our department, political science, Ed Brown. Yelena Biberman is an associate professor of political science at Skidmore College, now tenured, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council South Asia Program, South Asia Center, and an associate at Harvard's Davis Center. Her BA was from Wellesley College and has a master's from Harvard and a PhD from Brown, from our department here. And before she came to the PhD program, she also worked as a journalist in Moscow. I think we have a lot of questions for her over dinner tonight, so that'll be wonderful. Her book, Gambling with Violence, State Outsourcing of War in Pakistan and India, was published by Oxford University Press. That was my series, actually, Modern South Asia series, in 2019. And it tackled a global problem, particularly consequential for Pakistan and India, state outsourcing of violence to ordinary civilians, criminals, and ex-insurgents. So, Yelena, the next 12 minutes are yours.
Thank you. Should I get up, or is it okay to sit? Okay.
It's up to you if you want to.
So my nose is running. Yeah, I mean, I can.
We're all afraid to take the podium after you, Ashu.
No, so formal. Thank you so much. I want to thank Ashu so much for having me here in this wonderful workshop for what I know is going to be an influential book. And it's just so nice to see everyone again after all this time. And during this difficult time as well, right? Still. So I'm going to get straight to the point and discuss some of what I find important in Paul's contribution, as well as perhaps some limitations or things from moving forward. I think this is a book that opens up space for productive conversation on states, non-state actors, ideology, tactics, and also just kind of thinking the way, rethinking how we think about security, right? Is security that secure? Paul's argument about the primacy of ideology was really striking to me. In my book, which Ashram mentioned, Gambling with Violence, I have examined similar questions and cases from South Asia, but arrived actually at a different conclusion. I'll start by saying that I agree with Paul that ideology matters, right? But my book's main argument that I found, which is what I call balance of interests framework, is that tactical considerations drive state and non-state behavior in the alliances, and then ideology follows suit. And only in some instances I found ideology to play an important role in that interaction. I think there would have been a productive conversation between our arguments and the conclusions that Paul reached and my own. Also, what I find that is still that is still missing in the book was, and in addition to discussion of this potential alternative theory, is also sort of a systematic analysis of the interests of the non-state actors themselves, right? And kind of thinking about where that comes in and the role of ideology there as well. Another brand of scholarship, which I think would have been really nice to integrate and engage with, is relatively new. It's represented by people like Niloufer Siddiqui, Gareth Nellis, among others, and it talks about the role of electoral competition in driving state behavior. So, for example, Nellis and Siddiqui have shown that in Pakistan, secularist rule causes significant reduction in the activity of religiously motivated militants, which goes along with Paul's thesis. But they conclude that this is because of electoral pressures from core party supporters rather than ideological compatibility. So it would be nice to engage with that argument as well. Okay, so now I'm going to focus on the armed act.
Can you repeat this argument again? The Nellis Siddiqui argument?
Yeah, so they're saying it's because of the electoral pressures from core party supporters, not ideological compatibilities.
Drive militant behavior or drive government militant relations.
Yeah, lead secularist parties to crack down on Islamist militants.
So it's looking at Pakistan especially.
Yeah. So this was
versus
Right.
Yeah, APSR article from
Yeah, no,
2017.
I just wanted to remind you of that.
Yeah. So let's focus now on Paul's armed order framework. In particular, there are two concepts which have come up that merit attention because they're at the heart of the framework. The first one is ideology, and the second one is armed order. So as the late Alan Zuckerman used to remind us here at Brown, that to be applicable, a concept has to be both precise and useful. Ideology, and especially leaders' ideological projects, serve as the main independent variable and the main theoretical contribution in the book. Armed actors, armed groups that advance claims based on ideas, symbols, social groupings, which government leaders see as compatible with their ideological project, will be treated as legitimate. The main basis for evaluating whether a given violent non-state actor is threatening is ideological in the book. And the book offers three dimensions of ideology: nationalist inclusion, religious secular orientation, and the left-right spectrum. So although the book admits that ideology is one of those grand concepts, right, that is really contested, I find its operationalization as an umbrella for the aforementioned dimensions actually to be quite useful and not excessively reductionist, right? There are different ways to think about what ideology is. I was just, it could be, some consider it sort of a worldview which is used to extract consent of the public. But I think it's actually quite useful to use it this way here. Had the book instead used the more expansive term like national identity, we would have missed out on that fluidity that Paul talks about in the book. However, I think the formulation elite beliefs and perceptions maybe would have sounded less impressive, but perhaps gotten the job done as well. Overall, this book falls in the so-called gray zone between the type of simplification and categorization that we see in quantitative scholarship, which combines sophisticated methodology with rudimentary conceptualization, and the deep sensitivity to concepts and context that we see in ethnographic and historical literature. This gray zone is difficult to inhabit, and not everyone survives and succeeds in it. And of course, Paul has. The book's original contribution in the argument is that the argument that seeing like a state means seeing through the prism of ideology. The striking and perhaps counterintuitive claim is that when it comes to domestic security, material or power considerations come after ideological ones. Unlike, say, Samuel Huntington's emphasis in The Clash of Civilizations on the role of culture, this book adopts a more expansive term, ideology, to capture both culture and political orientation. This is reminiscent of the classic IR theory debates between proponents of defensive neorealism, constructivism, and even Wilsonian liberalism. This is compelling, and there was a missed opportunity, I think, to situate this framework in the IR canon. This is what Fotini does in her own work. And doing so, I think, would have made the framework more intuitive to those of us who are familiar with the IR debates as well. Okay, so as with international relations, of course, the reality is the book admits is complicated. And it may not always cooperate. So let's take a case that's currently unfolding before us. The ideological project of Putin's Russia is to recreate the glory days, but in the 21st century. However, is this what is primarily coloring Putin's threat perception? Or is it the more material security threats posed by NATO and EU expansion? I know this is something that everyone is arguing about right now, right? And some people getting into trouble over. Putin has used the pretense of neo-Nazis inside Ukraine and NATO expansion to justify the invasion in Ukraine. So which one is it? Is it NATO or is it the neo-Nazis? So I think there's a clue in how Putin has reacted to neo-Nazis inside Russia. He did not react at all. He did not deem them an ideological threat. So why? As repugnant as neo-Nazis may be, they may not be enough to start a war, right? So if it's primarily ideology that colors the state's threat perception, one question that came to me is why would an armed group not frame itself in a way that is more ideologically friendly to the state, especially when it's fighting for survival? Why do actors hold tightly to their values even when their survival is at stake, while others just let go, like the Ikhwan in Kashmir? Taking the perspectives of both the state and the non-state actors into account is something that Paul urges in the conclusion, and this is where I wish Paul engaged with my book, because it does precisely that. So because ordering violence is admittedly state-centric, it neglects the possibility of, one, that states and non-state actors can actually mutually shape each other's ideological orientation and thus threat perception. And two, that non-state actor can actually play a role in shaping the ideology of the state. Take the 1971 war, or the Pakistan Civil War, the Bangladesh Liberation War, whatever you want to call it. When we look closely at Pakistan before that war, we see that the Pakistani government and the Islamist militant groups, al-Badr and al-Shams, they were not necessarily ideologically compatible. The Pakistani army of 1971 was not Islamist in ideological orientation, as hard as it is to believe. As the leading Pakistan army expert, the late Stephen Cohn, explains, Pakistani army prior to Zia-ul-Haq's Islamization, starting in 1977, was actually largely a secular army with an occasional nod in the direction of Islam. Pakistan's first constitution of 1956 declared the state simultaneously Islamic and a parliamentary democracy. The former meant that the head of state was to be a Muslim and no law could contradict the Islamic jurisprudence. But just 2 years later, Ayub Khan established the country's first military regime, which pursued a greater separation of religion and the state. The word Islamic was removed from Pakistan's official name in the new constitution. Ayub used religion to legitimize selective reforms, but it was not until after the 71 war that Islam started to occupy an increasingly prominent role and position in political discourse. Pakistan's Islamist parties performed very poorly before 1971, including in the 1970 election. And it's the outcome of the 71 war that generated, the crisis in Pakistan, resulted in renewed concern with national identity and really trying to sort of shape its narrative, which then came to be known as Islamist. It may be that in times of war, tactical considerations come first and ideological second. I've argued in my book that the balance of power between the state and its adversaries, and that it creates, various relationships between the two. So ideology plays a role in attracting ideologically motivated non-state allies. I call those activists, following the work of Jeremy Weinstein. I found that genuinely ideologically motivated actors are very rare, in fact, at least among the non-states. I can't speak for the states. They're typically labeled extremists these days. For the rest, I call them opportunists, and states, for them, use material incentives to attract them to their cause. I want to now turn to another big concept in the book, the armed order. This concept strikes me as a little awkward. The book identifies 4 types of armed order: alliance, limited cooperation, containment, and total war. One category is missing, creation or co-creation, but there's no reason to think that this framework wouldn't apply to it. The concept of order is perhaps meant to evoke and contrast to the concept of anarchy. And its various forms as identified by Alexander Wendt. However, in this case, what is being described is not order, it seems to me, but a type of relationship between 2 types of actors, as important as those actors are. It is about the relationship between all the, to me, when I think of order, I think of all the different societal actors that are involved in forming that order, not just two actors that have a relationship. So, the qualifier armed order, I think, to me, exacerbates the confusion because, why not just call it a relationship, right? All those different alliances. Okay. So in conclusion, I want to say that I appreciate the ambition and the effort of this book, which should be ambitious. Paul shared in the acknowledgments that this project was punctuated and enriched by the joys and sleeplessness of fatherhood. And with a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, I certainly relate. He also expresses that he hopes that his work contributes to overcoming the silos in existing political violence scholarship. And I really share this mission. And I just want to say that in doing so successfully requires both daring but also inclusive scholarship. Thank you.
Our next commentator is Megan Turnbull, also a graduate of our Department of Political Science at Brown. She is now assistant professor of comparative politics at the University of Georgia, and this year a research fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. The book she's writing, based in part on her dissertation, is entitled Political Order and Joint Organization of Election Violence in Nigeria, and look at the remarkable similarity, at least to some extent, between what she is trying to do there and what Paul has done in this book. She deals with the conditions under which subnational political elites and non-state actors jointly organize her dependent variable is pre-election violence. But she deals also with the conditions under which subnational actors repress these non-state groups, conditions under which collaborate with them, conditions under which an alliance might emerge. So it's roughly the same problematic, but what is being explained is election violence. Yeah. Megan, now it's you. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Thanks. All right, I'm going to set my timer to try to stay on time. Okay, great. So thank you for the invitation. I have so enjoyed reading this book, and I'm really excited to be here with just a panel of excellent scholars today to talk about what I think are some really exciting directions for future research on political order and violence. So I thought I would start with what I think are some really big, important contributions, and then get into some comments and questions, which I think already build off what Yelena and Fotini have already said. So I'm going to stick to 3 contributions. I think there's a lot more, but these for me really stand out as like the key ones. So first, I think this book pushes us to think really deeply about how violence is used to construct political order, right? So that is what counts as mainstream and radical politics is not given, right? And instead, what Paul shows is how state violence is deployed to carve out and then maintain boundaries around what constitutes mainstream politics, what constitutes radical politics, and what is going to be politically acceptable, and what is going to be considered politically dangerous. And it reminds us not to take these boundaries between mainstream and radical politics for granted, right, in the countries we grew up in or the countries that we study now. And for me, this book stands alongside previous work that has also touched on these questions about how violence is used to construct political order. So I think of Charles Tilley, I think of Sam Huntington's work, Political Order in Changing Societies. I think this really old article by Barrington Moore from 1968 about violence and democracy. And I think about criminal governance in Latin America from more recent work today, as well as Yelena and Fotini's work too. So for me, this book stands in that larger body of work that continues to push us to think really critically about how violence is used to construct and then maintain different political orders, right? And not to take these boundaries for granted. A second big contribution is that I think it makes this really compelling case to think of Weberian statehood as just one type of political order that we can study around the world. So I remember when I was in graduate school, there was these debates, that we read in graduate seminars about strong states and weak states, strong states versus failed states. And it just seems like those are the only two things that were out there in the world. You had Weberian statehood, or you had a failed state. And in some previous scholarship, the presence of an armed actor in a country's territory was just evidence that you have a failed state, right? And that was it. But what Paul is showing us is that we're leaving so much variation on the table if we're not looking at the different types of relationships that emerge between governments and armed groups and how they evolve over time, right? I think future work might explore the consequences of these relationships for social life, political life, and economic life as well, to dive more deeply into what the consequences of these armed orders are, right? So for me, I very much welcome this contribution because I don't have to think about strong states and failed states anymore, but there's a lot more variation out there in the world that's really important. Okay. Third, I think this book carries some really important policy implications, especially for security sector aid. So I know Paul doesn't offer much in the conclusion. He offers some broad ideas about what policy implications there are, but doesn't want to get into any fine-grained detail. I'm not going to either, but it strikes me that practitioners and policymakers would do really well to read this book, right? So if we're dealing with weak but well-intentioned states, then it seems like policy programs that are just going to invest more money into improving policing capacity or military capacity is not going to do a great job of improving public security, right? If we're in the world that Paul is dealing with, and which I think a lot of governments look like around the world, where they deliberately tolerate or cooperate with armed groups in their territory, then security sector aid is going to have to look a lot different, right? Instead of just pouring money into policing programs, we might want to think about independent civilian oversight or monitoring programs, and also conditionality of providing some kind of aid for governments if they're going to if these programs are to be effective. So I also think of Rachel Kleinfeld's work when I was reading this book as well, and thinking more concretely about, okay, if we're dealing with governments that are strategically providing support to armed groups, then what does that mean for donors and practitioners and policymakers who are interested in security and trying to move away from this idea that it's just a weak state capacity problem, we have to put more money into the situation. Okay. So now let me move into some comments and some questions that I hope will lay the foundation for a vibrant conversation today. So one of the questions that I kept coming back to as I was reading this book is whether or not this is a story about government armed group relationships, or if this is a story about how governments are responding to armed groups. And to me, these are two outcomes of interest, right? Two different outcomes of interest. And I think it's important to disentangle them if we're to deepen our understanding of the armed orders that Paul is studying in the book. So to be fair, there's a number of places where Paul says, I have a state-centric argument here. I'm really focusing on how governments are responding to armed groups, right? And that's fair, but I think there's a few places throughout the book where there's this assumption that the government is going to get its way, right? The government is going to get the type of relationship that it wants. And then sometimes it feels like the strategy or the relationship that the government is pursuing is just automatically the relationship that emerges, right? And sometimes maybe that is the case. Governments are pretty strong vis-a-vis armed groups. Sometimes they do get their way. But sometimes the government doesn't always get its way, right? So it may be pursuing one particular strategy or have a preference for one type of relationship, but that relationship doesn't pan out. Maybe because the armed group in question has the leverage and the resources to push back against the government, or maybe there's other things going on in the country and those in power are unable to pursue the relationship that it wants, or it backfires in some way. So instead, what we have is a difference between what the strategy, the relationship the government would like to pursue, and the relationship that is actually emerging. I think in future work, we need to be careful in disentangling these two things, because they do strike me as two different outcomes of interest. Okay. Secondly, another question that kept kind of knocking around in my head when I was reading this book is whether or not the type of armed group matters for how the government responds to it, right? So this book has a very broad, inclusive definition of armed groups that centers around political ideology to understand how governments are reacting to them. But something that I was wondering about, especially when it comes to these gray zone groups, right, which seems to capture a lot of different actors, is that whether or not the government is dealing with a vigilante group, an ethnic militia, the armed wing of a political party, an armed labor union, or a rebel group, that the type of group it's confronted with is going to factor into how the government is responding to that group, right? So ideology is an important variable here, but I also started to think, especially as we get into this gray zone where there's this really diverse population of different types of actors. And some of these actors, to be fair, are really hard to classify. I found this in my own work in Nigeria and elsewhere in Africa, where many groups have a mix of activities that makes their classification really difficult, right? But some groups are clearly ethnic militias, some are clearly vigilantes, and they might be perceived as more or less threatening, right, by governments, and that's going to impact how governments are responding to them. So that was something I kept wondering about. And again, it seems like when it comes to these gray zone groups, that's going to be especially important here. All right. Another thing that kept coming up for me as I was reading the book is I kept wondering about rival explanations too. And I think this book makes a really compelling case for the role of political ideology and tactical interest. But thinking about the countries I know a little bit better, I should say far better than countries I know in South Asia, which is like, I know next to nothing about South Asia. But I kept thinking about, well, what about in the context I know and study about how governments are responding to armed groups? So I'm going to throw a few out there and then see what maybe what you might think about these in response. So one is inspired by Catherine Boone's work on state development in Africa. So you might expect central governments to tolerate or ignore armed groups in economically unproductive regions that are generating or providing little to government revenue, right? So these are regions where maybe the government doesn't care all that much about them because they're not getting a lot of money from those regions, right? So they're not too important for the government. So you might expect that in those regions, governments are willing to tolerate or ignore armed groups there, right? They don't think that they're worth investing in those regions to try to project state power and build up state infrastructure to establish state authority in those regions. Conversely, if we're dealing with regions that are economically productive and they are generating a lot of government revenue, we can imagine that those in the capital care a lot more about those regions, right? And then whether or not governments are going to cooperate with or repress armed groups in those regions, that might be determined by how those groups are positioning themselves vis-a-vis the state, right? So I think this also touches on Yelena's point about, well, maybe armed groups are taking into account the kind of ideological projects that governments have, and then trying to tactfully position themselves one way or another in response to those projects to build different relationships with governments that they find to be productive or lucrative, right? So then we might imagine that in economically productive regions, armed groups that are trying to position themselves as potential government allies, we're more likely to see cooperation, and dissident groups are going to get more of a crackdown, right? Or more repression. I also kept thinking about coalitional politics as a second explanation. So this comes from Bethany Lasina's work on India and counterinsurgency, and also a lot of others who have studied coalitional politics and violence, such as Fotini's work. And I could imagine a story where armed groups that are helpful for building and maintaining a winning coalition that allows political parties to grab national power and to hold on to it, those groups are going to get toleration or support, right? And this could be because they're connected to local elites that are really important for the winning coalition, or they're local strongmen themselves that governments need in regions that are going to be important to building a minimum winning coalition. Conversely, groups that are not important for building that winning coalition, they're more likely to get repressed, right? So I kept thinking about the ties between the capital and the periphery and shaping how those in power in the capital might be responding to different armed groups around the country, and thinking about the importance of winning coalitions for holding on to national power. Okay. And a last rival explanation that I'll just throw out there that I think there's a lot to unpack has to do with the international context, right? So I'm thinking about work from Will Reno on armed politics in Africa, especially his book, I think, from the late 1990s, Warlord Politics. It makes this really interesting argument about how these major shifts in the international political economy, demands for economic and political reforms from donors and foreign governments. Okay, my time is up, so I'm going to wrap it up. that's shaping how incumbents in West Africa and beyond are responding to different types of armed groups in their territory, right? So there's a lot to unpack here. It could be reliance on foreign aid. It could be the geostrategic importance of that country in a regional conflict. Some governments may have more leverage vis-a-vis foreign donors because they're major oil exporters, or they play some important role in that regional context. So they have more leeway to do what they want with armed groups. Whereas those that are more reliant on foreign aid, maybe they have a little less space, right? So that might expand or restrict the possibility of relationships between governments and armed groups. Okay, the last thing I'll say, and I apologize if this is a bit of a wacky explanation, but in a former life, I was a political theorist. So I couldn't help but think, before I became a comparativist, this book also got me thinking about the ethics of state building, right? So I think there's this bias in the post-conflict context of wanting to rebuild state authority, right? But it seems like the story that you have very convincingly laid out here raises some really good questions about under what conditions is it ethical to invest in state building, right? And giving some very violent actors they're already doing a lot of harm, giving them more power and more resources to do so. So I think this is something of a deeper question that might push some of us to rethink our commitment to a Weberian state, and instead thinking about, well, maybe it's not always entirely ethical to invest in that kind of political project. Thank you very much. I apologize for going over.
When Megan was a political theorist, she used to think, she said once, she used to think that reading Rousseau in Paris was equal to fieldwork. That was a brilliant sentence that I still recall from one of the seminars. Reading Rousseau in Paris was equal to fieldwork. Vipin Narang is our last commentator, Frank Stanton Professor of Nuclear Security and Political Science, and a long-standing member of the Security Studies program at MIT. His research interests include nuclear proliferation and strategy, South Asian security. We collaborate on a seminar together on South Asia, Brown Harvard MIT seminar, general security studies, and now I know why he's been going to Korea so much, North Korea's nuclear weapons as well. His first book, Nuclear Strategy in the Modern Era, was published by Princeton University Press in 2014 and got the ISA International Security Studies Best Book Award. Second book, Seeking the Bomb, Strategies of Nuclear Proliferation, was published quite recently, I think a few months ago, right? And his work has appeared in a variety of outlets, including International Security, Journal of Conflict Resolution, I.O., Foreign Affairs, Washington Post, New York Times. He also cares about the public sphere. And he was the recipient of the 2020 ISSS, what's that? Emerging Scholar Award. That must have been a long time ago. Now that you're a fully tenured, full professor, that must have been a long time ago. Vipin. Yeah, okay.
Thanks, Ashu. Great to be here. A real pleasure and treat. Thanks for having me and allowing me to be on this distinguished panel with scholars who I admire so much. I am the odd person out. I don't work on sort of civil conflict, civil and ethnic conflict. I work primarily on nuclear weapons and moonlight as a South Asianist. I think I was asked to speak here mostly to roast Paul, with whom I suffered through graduate school along with. He at MIT, I at Harvard. We took Hindi Urdu together, and I'm always a couple months behind him in publish. He published his first book, I think 4 months before my first book, and published his second book 4 months before my second book. But he's always been a great friend, a great role model. We've battled more things that I can say on a YouTube stream together, fatherhood, hair loss, university bureaucracies, publishers. I think my biggest complaint about this awesome book is that it wasn't written with enough snark that he reserves for his Twitter feed. But let me say that I think I want to discuss and highlight some of the things as a quasi-outsider to this field that I think are really important about the book. And then I'll raise some questions for future research, mostly repackaging some of the excellent comments that have already been mentioned. But what I think the biggest thing about this book in the context of the field is it shows that macro theory and macro historical books are still important and still possible. As the field has gone increasingly micro and experimental, I think Paul shows us that there is still room for and important questions to be asked and answered at a macro theoretical and a macro historical level. And I think it sort of brings those features, both theoretically and empirically, back squarely in the field. And this is a big swing of a book. I mean, this is trying to sort of situate the relationship, the state formation process and the state existence process back squarely into the literature on civil conflicts and ethnic violence. And it's about sort of how states manage internal violence and still succeed in maintaining sort of the protein structure of the state. And it is a model for graduate students and scholars about how to do this kind of work. So he should be lauded and congratulated for, I think, providing us with a really exemplary model of how to do macro-historical, macro-theoretical work in this field, not just in civil and ethnic conflict, but also in political science writ large. And although the case studies are in South Asia, it is a model for how to theoretically and conceptually think about sort of state relationships with armed actors across the world, and I'll come back to that at the end. So I'll be brief here because I want to open it up, to discussion and let Paul take a swing back at all of us. But I trade in typologies also in nuclear security. Both of my books, like Paul's book, I basically used Paul's book as a model for mine with nuclear weapons. And if ever our research interests coincide in a single case study, we would have a lot of problems. Pakistan has come close over the years. I have several sort of comments and areas of future research to think about. One typological, a couple theoretical, and then some empirical comments. Typologically, I think the biggest contribution is going beyond the binary of sort of total war and accommodation with armed actors within a state. And this gray zone area is, I think, where a lot of the action is, right? So as Paul said, we're not looking at the 0-1s, but also at the 0.25s, the asterisks, and the 0.75s. He has two categories here, containment and limited cooperation. And these are conceptually, I think, distinct. In practice, I think my question is, how do we observe them without blurriness, and whether they're actually as mutually exclusive as the typology suggests? And when we're coding sort of a state relationship with an armed group, is it possible either there's blurriness between the categories? Limited cooperation and containment can sometimes look very, very close to each other, sort of temporary ceasefires while at the same time trying to prevent the armed group from expanding beyond its territorial ambitions or territorial control. Or can a state sort of contain and cooperate limitedly at the same time? So the gray area here has two sort of types, but I wonder how distinct they are, and whether it's possible to theorize and conceptualize in even more systematically about the gray zone area, which I think is the biggest contribution of the book. But as Paul admits in caveats, there is a lot of action and sort of categories in here that blur together, and whether it makes sense to sort of treat the gray area as one big aggregate group, or whether we can sort of subdivide it systematically beyond containment and limited cooperation. Limited cooperation has a lot of possible sort of permutations that are worth exploring. The theoretical point or comment is most of the theory here, as Paul talks about and as other commentators have suggested, is state-centric. It's state ideology. There is sort of my biggest question through the book, both theoretically and empirically, is sort of the relationship between state ideology, armed actor, center ideology, armed actor ideology, and then the balance of capabilities, especially as armed actors get stronger? Does the threat they pose to the center rise even if the ideologies are held constant? And this will come up in sort of the empirical comment in the only sort of case I know, which is India, and even then, not even these Northeast cases, which are fascinating, but well beyond my scope. But I wonder whether sort of the perception of threat is driven more, especially over time, as the center's observation or perception of the capabilities of the armed actor grows, and not just sort of the ideological balance between the center and the armed group. A related question is also measurement. How accurate states are in assessing the ideologies and the capabilities of the armed actors, right? So are there cases where a state believes it has sort of, it can have a business partnership in the gray zone, but it turns out that the armed actor is actually ideologically opposed, and then it has to shift sort of its strategy? Because a lot of the work in the shift, in sort of changes over time, in the theory, really have to be either regime change or a change in the center's ideology. But I wonder whether there's sort of changes in assessment or changes in capability of the armed group itself that lead to changes in strategy. The third sort of point, so the theoretical point is really the role of capabilities and strength of the armed actors, and the balance of how do we think about, ideology doing the work, or at least proximately, is the rising capabilities either externally supported? So in the Indian case, the Khalistanis and the Kashmiri insurgents are obviously getting third-party support at times from Pakistan, and does that shift sort of the center's view of the threat that these armed groups pose? The empirical sort of question, and I'll use sort of the Khalistani example, the India center's approach to the insurgency in Punjab in the 1980s and beyond as an example. So the Congress strategy shifts from sort of business partnership to stoking and cultivating the Khalistani insurgency to what I would classify as total war. And eventually and I think you discuss it similarly. But what causes the shift is not a shift sort of in ideology or assessments. It's the center's ability to control the more extreme elements of the Khalistani movement become more difficult, and there's sort of a blowback effect. And either the aims of the Khalistani insurgency, which are always sort of nominally secessionist, become more threatening because they become more capable, or the secessionist sort of aim becomes more sort of salient and obvious to the center. But what explains the shift? Because it's all under sort of in the Congress party, so you have sort of constant state ideology, but you have a shift in strategy from the center to the Khalistani insurgency in the 1980s through the 1990s. And relatedly, the theory would predict that the BJP would behave differently, I would think, right? So is it the case, or they would behave the same but for different reasons, which is the Congress party opposes secession, the BJP opposes Sikh secessions because they're Sikh, not because of necessarily secession, but the strategy would be the same. And the counterfactual is if it was a BJP government then, and we're seeing sort of, with the resurgence of the Khalistani, at least nominally, potential resurgence of the Khalistani movement, the BJP seems to be sort of treating the Khalistani movement the same way the Congress party did, all right? And it's the threat of secession. And I wonder how much sort of it's not sort of the Nehruvian Congress ideology versus Hindu nationalism doing the work here, but just secession, right? That any Indian government would oppose any secessionist movement, regardless of sort of the religious component or the post-colonial. I think secession sort of fits with your view of the Congress ideology, right? Keeping the territorial limits of India intact. So Congress would oppose any secession movement, but is it fair to say that the BJP would also sort of oppose secession? And whether, as an alternative explanation, as Megan suggested, is that all Indian governments just oppose any secessionist movement regardless of what form it takes, and especially in the core, right? So Kashmiri and Punjabi or Khalistani secession movements especially, And in the periphery, we see a lot more sort of gray zone because the center just doesn't care as much, and they're willing to devolve authority in ways that they may not be willing to do in places like Punjab. And so I'm just, as sort of both alternative explanations, but also empirically, what's doing the work in the shift in strategy if it's not sort of a regime change at the center, but some characteristic of the insurgency or the armed actor itself as its goals become either more extreme or they become more capable. Finally, and this is something that I think that Paul has started working on, I think one of the darkest implications of the book and one of the most important implications of the book is sort of the external validity to the United States and how sort of after the last 4 years, or the last 4 years before the last year, the center and the Trump government dealt with armed actors in the United States. And what does the book say? I mean, it's really, I think, terrifying when sort of American politics meets sort of the business end of comparative politics. And we now have, sort of an out-of-sample case that hits really close to home. And sort of how does the book, and what does the book potentially say about sort of the proliferation of armed actors and armed politics in the United States, because it has really huge implications, I think, for our politics at home today. But I want to congratulate Paul on what is just an absolutely outstanding book. It's a big swing. It shows big swings are still possible in the discipline and can have a huge impact. It's sort of all of these scholars' work here in the room that keep me sort of grounded in South Asian security outside of just nuclear weapons. These are the books that I think the rest of the field especially can learn from, can digest, and are really going to have huge impacts, both theoretically, typologically, and empirically on comparative politics, but on political science writ large. So with that, I'll close, and then we'll open up to comments and discussion.
So how do you want to take it, Paul? Do you want to collect some more questions, or do you want to? I think you whatever. Let's give you up to 10 minutes to 10 minutes plus and then we'll collect questions. And the security scholars sitting here, so we'll probably have questions. Right?
Yeah, I'll be brief and also thank everybody for thoughtful and serious commentary. Favorable, critical, thoughtful, all of it, I really appreciate. So let me just kind of talk about each of the comments and just give a couple quick thoughts. I think for Fotini, there are many excellent questions here. One issue that recurs across, I think, a lot of these is where the macro meets the micro, right? And I think this is a fair point. This is not a micro book. I think there's a lot of stuff on the ground that's really important that I'm not able to really account for, right? I'm interested in these broader patterns of general accommodation, repression, some more fine-grained stuff. So there are real trade-offs that come with that, right? It's kind of looking at these big macro-historical trends. And I think at various points in the book, I call this a radically simplified account that's trying to get at something that tells us hopefully something fairly fundamental about how regimes are trying to govern violence. But I accept that in a lot of these cases, there are going to be microdynamics that I don't have anything particularly interesting to say about. In terms of network dynamics, I agree with Fotini. I don't know how to do it methodologically, but there are lots of different approaches to network analysis that I think would make sense for people to apply to these kinds of data and these kinds of questions. I think in terms of scope, I try to be pretty clear about scope, that I'm really, there's a whole world that I just don't think I have a lot to say about. And so I kind of say, read Fotini's book for a lot of that stuff, right? I think you could imagine worlds in which contending political projects, right? Think about what is the reconstruction of the state of Iraq after 2003. Contending, ideological, ethno-sectarian, nationalist projects tell us a lot about who wants what, right? And kind of what alliances are more and less palatable. It's striking to me, both in the Syrian war and then in the rise of ISIS, that the kind of fluidity we see in some conflicts really hasn't existed in some of these other conflicts, right? And it may just be idiosyncratic, but it may have something to do with the ways in which, for instance, ISIS or the Syrian regime articulate kind of what's acceptable and what's not, and what space there is for bargaining and amnesties and side switching. In some of these cases, I think there's very little, right? And I think that's something that we might be able to helpfully understand through the lens of this project. Where we go from here, I think, is a great question. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about it as I talk to some of these other comments. So Yelena offers what I think are a really excellent set of comments, and I think something I want to be transparent about is that, to be honest, most of the book was done by 2018. So there's a whole slew of work that was published afterwards that I'm basically like, I finished the data set in 2019 and went in for review in the early days of the pandemic. So there's stuff by a variety of people, including Yelena, that I'm sure is not receiving kind of the due engagement. The guts of the book were published in 2012 and 2015, and then it was kind of, I've been working on the empirical stuff in the aftermath. So there is a rich variety of other works that I would strongly encourage people to read. Most of the book was done before a lot of that was done. So that's my failing and a limit of the manuscript. I do think that these projects are often talking about somewhat different things, though. So let me, for instance, work on kind of nitty-gritty dynamics of militia recruitment. I don't think this is a book about that. I think it's a book about, there's a group that's out there, what does the state try to do with it? And at a broad level, does it accommodate it or does it repress it? And I think that's potentially different than, for instance, how does a secular government try to crack down or not, right? And what does that have to do with electoral incentives? So it's very fine-grained, micro-level analysis that I think is great. It's not really what I can offer in this project, right? I think there's some more specific critiques that I take very, very well here from Yelena. I think the gray zone, and this is something that comes up in Megan's work, can be mushy, and I think it raises or begs the question of why armed groups don't really, sometimes they maneuver and they try to reshape their framing. Other times they double down. So let's use the 1971 example. I don't know the answer to that. I offer some thoughts in chapter 2 of the book about why you might get either. But I'm not sure anybody, I don't know if we have a great theory of armed group ideological positioning across all space and time. So let's talk about 1971, which is an example Yelena brings up that I think suggests both strengths of my argument and also some real limits, right? So it's true that Ayub Khan is not your classic Islamist. But in his diaries and elsewhere, he talks at great length about how much he despises Bengali secessionism. He doesn't like the mullahs, but he really hates Bengali secessionism, right? And this is true of the West Pakistani elite in general. So that raises, so I think actually like the links between the Pakistani military and Islamist militias, like they don't have to love each other to like each other much more than they like the prospect of Bengali separatism. That said, why don't Bengali separatists moderate their war aims? Why don't they say, look, we're actually really good Muslims, / we're happy to engage in the oligarchic political economy of West Pakistan, and they can get something. They don't, they double down in certain ways. Now, they don't double down in some ways the Pakistani military says they do, but basically, the movement says, look, we deserve our fair share. So I think there's conditions under which armed groups actually, their benefits that they gain from mobilizing powerfully resolved oppositional positions that actually might be very difficult to move off of. And so I kind of gesture in chapter 2 about some of the challenges that armed group leaders can have in moderating or changing their framing, right? They have constituents. They have internal armed actors who may not be happy with selling out, moderating, being co-opted, whatever you want to call it, right? And so I think that I'm not sure any of us has a great account for when groups moderate and when they don't. We have arguments about spoiling, we have arguments about internal dynamics, we have arguments about co-optation. But I do think this is an area that deserves much broad study across a whole bunch of armed groups in a bunch of different contexts, right? So I don't have a great account of that, but I think that's a future direction. It does make me less concerned about, not less concerned about the issue of why armed groups don't change, because I think it basically suggests that some armed groups don't change their positioning. We don't necessarily know why. I can think of 5 different explanations. I'm not sure which is right. But I think actually 1971 suggests some of the problems here that we all face, which is why not moderate if you're an armed or secessionist actor? And I don't think we have a great answer for that. I do think that there is this world in which groups that don't love each other, like Ayub Khan and Islamist militants, might like each other far more than kind of universally despised ethno-linguistic separatists. So that's something I would, maybe a way I would respond, to the 1971 critique. Now, Yelena, Fotini, and Megan, and Vipin all raise a broader question, right? Which is, what's the deal with material incentives and power? And so let me say 2 things. One is, I thought, and I think maybe not successfully, but I tried to say in the book, there are all these on-the-ground dynamics of tactical, operational stuff that are important. Yes, that's fine. I'm not arguing that those are irrelevant in some way. I guess where I ultimately come down is that I think those matter on the ground in some very fundamental ways. I'm less convinced that those are driving these long-run macro-historical patterns of accommodation and crackdown. I could be wrong about that. People can read my book against other people's books and articles and kind of make that decision for themselves. But looking at, for instance, Sri Lanka, looking at Myanmar, looking at India, looking at Pakistan, I guess I don't find an easy way to make sense of their broad patterns of accommodation or repression without taking seriously some of these kind of fairly fundamental questions of threat perception. Who are our friends, who are our enemies, and who's in between, right? And so there may be specific cases, as I acknowledge, where these ideological dynamics break down and you get a purely tactical battle for survival. But there are a lot of cases where the state has a lot more slack. Do we give it a ceasefire to this group or keep fighting it? You can make a plausible, intuitive material argument often in either direction, right? And so I think there's something that we political context-wise that is worth thinking about, these background threat perceptions, these long-run trends that I think are hard to understand without taking some of this historical threat perception seriously. So go ahead.
Question,
Yep.
Paul, about Khalistan.
Sure.
So first, Mrs. Gandhi is encouraging Khalistanis as a way to electorally divide the Sikh.
Strange bedfellows,
right?
is what I say. Yep.
Yeah. And then she begins to, it's not clear, there's a fuzzy zone for some
Yep.
time, and then it's total war.
And then it becomes, so here's my
So
interpretation.
in a matter of 15 years, you get 3 different postures.
Well, in a matter of about 5 years. Yeah,
Years.
by 1985.
Okay, less than, yeah. Less
So,
than,
you know, I mean, we can talk about this, but basically, the way I would interpret that case, and others can disagree with it, right, is that a part of the Congress Party sees a tactical advantage of using these militants to split a regional party. Okay. They think they can control them, that they'll go away, or just not be a major threat. They then start to escalate their war and start making increasingly unpalatable demands and start using violence, right? So this is kind of gets to these material issues. These two are kind of happening simultaneously, right? So I can't pull them apart. But certainly then you see sustained state crackdowns as it becomes clear what the Khalistan project is politically. It's not just an internecine war between different Sikh sects, right? It's not just like a little sideline thing that you're going to manipulate for your own advantage, but it emerges into a much deeper challenge.
So
Okay.
the shift is because it's.
Okay, so but the other question he's asking, which is.
I mean, that would be part of a story,
Yeah,
yes.
So the other thing that he's asking,
Yep.
wouldn't BJP have acted similarly?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, I actually don't think the
issue is
BJP.
secession there.
Yeah, I don't. So here's what I would say.
The issue is secession there, the issue is not what kind of secession.
I think
The issue is simply secession. Huh?
So 2 things. Secession in general, Indian governments aren't into, full stop.
Yeah.
Second, where there is more space for accommodation is determined in part by kind of the issues in the Constitution where there's more space to do business, tribe and language.
Right,
Primarily, that's why the Northeast looks the way it does.
okay.
Okay? So yeah, the BJP and Congress, I don't know, like BJP and Congress both care a heck of a lot about Kashmir for somewhat different reasons, but neither of them are, you know, it's mostly crackdowns and paramilitary stuff, right? It's not, I mean, there's some ceasefires, but nothing remotely even comparable in any way to what you see in the Northeast. So I think actually the BJP and Congress, in terms of certain aspects of counterinsurgency and internal security, there aren't big changes. Amit Shah loves cutting ceasefires in the Northeast. Right? Loves it. Okay, I've spoken for 10 minutes. Let me say a couple more quick things. Okay, Megan has a bunch of great points as well. Yes, probably the type of armed group matters a lot. I agree with you. Rival explanations, there are a bunch. I don't think the Boone story travels in the cases I'm familiar with, but I love her book. I think the Lucena story is sometimes right. I think it requires pretty powerful armed groups. I think this is, so I slide this tactical overlap in cases like the MQM in Karachi, where it could be a really useful part of a coalition. It's like, we can do business, right? And so coalitionally, yes, I think absolutely sometimes this can be the case. Other groups are completely irrelevant to meaningful coalition building. And so sometimes this matters, sometimes it doesn't. International context, happy to talk more about this in Q&A. I've got a new project that's going to be more about international context. And then I think I, whether correctly or not, dealt with like some of the capabilities, Khalistan stuff that Vipin was bringing up. But also I'm out of time, and BJP questions, so I don't want to keep rambling. But Q&A now, what do you want to do?
Yeah, let's see what are there any questions? Yeah, I expect you to. Yeah. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much. This is really exciting and terrific. As the most outsider in the room, I'm having trouble following a little bit of the empirics here about the variations at the subnational level. And so I actually have a question about that will hopefully be just down to the baseline, and then a second question that might be unfair. The first is that, can you give us examples, very basic examples for those of us who might not know the actors that you were talking about, of a group, for instance, like this one you're speaking about in the northern Burma, where it's truly puzzling why something as simple as deterrence or a status quo would not explain it, right? So if I've got 20,000 armed actors, it might make sense to me in the centralized government to say, well, it's not really worth it to me at the moment to carry out a repressive action here, right? What other examples do we have that show us very clearly that, like, I am not deterred from repression here, but in fact I have chosen to engage in racism anyway, right? And not chosen a crackdown path. The second question is about a context that I am more familiar with. This is just an international relations scholar to say, what can you tell us about what is not your DB, but what effect this has on the stability of the international system, or stability of relations across borders in South Asia? Does my choice about how to accommodate or suppress some of these groups affect the likelihood of violence, right? Escalation between rivals in South Asia?
Okay, should I just take one at a time, Ashu? So on the second one, I need to think about that. On the first, so I think, let's say I think it's interesting that your starting point was this, is like, well, why would you crack down on a big, strong armed group, right? Because you could imagine an intuitive response that goes in exactly the opposite way, which is, I don't know, the American Confederacy just seceded, they're big and strong. Maybe we should just kind of leave them alone for a while, we're deterred, right? I think there is an intuitive, in at least some of the state building literature, that like, no, these are the most pressing threats of groups we need to destroy because they pose the biggest problem for the regime, right? So I guess it kind of depends on your starting points here. I think if the Myanmar military had decided that it wanted to go to war against this group, it plausibly could have. It would have been costly and bloody. It would have been a hassle, but that's been true of most Myanmar counterinsurgencies since 1948. They haven't won most of their wars. They're still fighting a whole bunch of them. And so, at least in some circumstances, they're perfectly willing to be not deterred by the prospect of very costly conflict, right? So other cases we might think about, right, there are these two powerful Kurdish armed parties in northern Iraq. And like, what's the deal with them, right? Saddam Hussein was very interested in repressing them very intensely, using things like chemical weapons, right? And then through some combination of a no-fly zone and then the new post-2003 Iraqi political dispensation, like the Peshmerga and the two armed parties are kind of up there. The Baghdad government sometimes clashes with them over control of places like Kirkuk, but like it's not just deterrence, right? There's also some kind of political arrangement that's been struck about what's going to be kind of acceptable, right? This is true of Shia militias as well. So I think, this cuts in a couple of different ways, but it's not obvious that the starting point would be like, oh, there's a big, strong armed group on our territory, we better not touch it, right? I think in a lot of cases you might expect exactly the opposite. And plus there's a lot of variation even within countries about when that deterrence holds. Then there's the question of stability across borders that I don't know the answer to. Let me think for a second. I mean, I think this is one way, right, that you can make an argument about kind of Pakistani behavior in the region, right, which is, and potentially the behavior of the new Afghan regime, the new Taliban regime, which has thus far not cracked down on a whole variety of actors. Now, there's a tactical military reason for that as well, right, but it's not like they're hanging out with a bunch of Maoists, right, and propping them up as they're striking arm into, neighboring countries. So there's some overlap in that case of kind of like the strategic utility of having proxies with the fact that these are proxies that are mostly not making trouble for them at home, right? And so I think this can create all kinds of instability when countries are sponsoring groups that are kind of seen as unproblematic, right? Or only problematic in as so much as they might cause escalatory problems. And so that might be one way to think about kind of these proxy war dynamics, but that's a very ill-formed kind of random answer, so I'll leave it at that.
More questions?
Yep.
Thank you, Paul. First, I was wondering if you could talk about civil-military dynamics, especially in the context of Pakistan, and specifically concerning the tactical use of armed non-state groups by the military against the civilian government. So the military essentially using these armed non-state groups as a bargaining chip against the civilian government. And how might we think that the military acting as an actor separate from this civilian government could mean for the relationship between armed non-state groups and the state as a whole? And then secondly, and really quickly, how would you use your theoretical framework to explain the recent emergence and conduct of the TLP, the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan in Pakistan?
Yeah, so
Can you say more about this second group, since you're an expert on that area?
The Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan is sort of it emerged as a hardcore religious party. Now it's been touted by the Imran Khan government as a militant organization that allegedly has had links and support to India, even. So it has evolved really quickly, and this has happened in the last like 3 to 4 years. And its ability to sort of strike.
Is it in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Sindh, Balochistan, where?
So it's in and around the capital city. So its ability to basically make the capital come to a standstill is just mind-boggling.
So the civil military, so Pakistan's problematic in terms of how we think about what the state even is here, right? So let me first caveat that. I try to caveat in the chapter. I focus primarily on kind of military elites because they tend to have more control over security policy. So I think there are a couple considerations about civil-military dynamics. I don't have an off-the-top-of-my-head answer to your question, but I think there's one issue that civilians have with dealing with armed actors is they're reliant on militaries, and that can cut in a bunch of different ways, right? So Bhutto is forced to send the military into Balochistan in 1973. He doesn't want to, right? He wants to suppress the military, or kind of keep the military limited. He has to use them in counterinsurgency, or he feels like he has to, because he doesn't want to really accommodate Baluch separatism, right, which is a recurring theme in Pakistan. And so that gives the military a renewed kind of lease on life, right? More resources, more autonomy, right? So sometimes civilians are forced, kind of they lose power because they decide the military is needed against armed groups. I think there are these cases where militaries use armed groups as either against civilians or as kind of tools that civilians might ask them to do something with, right? And that, I'm not exactly sure what to say about that at this point, right? I guess you could imagine a world in which we think of the military as the state, right? And one of its goals is to get rid of our civilians or to hassle them, and so it looks around for proxies it can use against them. So that might be one way of thinking about it. That's related to this question of the TLP, which is mobilizing a set of kind of idioms and claims that can be wrapped in the Pakistani flag, right? I mean, this is the whole thing about this whole process is a lot of these groups, some of the most difficult ones for states to deal with in terms of repression are those that are kind of claiming to be more authentic than the state itself. They're mobilizing the same kind of symbols, right? So this is the problem of vigilantism in places like India or Indonesia or even the US, where it's like, it's not that they're opposing the system from without, in certain senses. They're saying, no, to truly do, I don't know, punish blasphemers the way we should, right? Or to truly uphold our cultural ethos or whatever, we need to go farther than the state is willing to go because the state is soft and weak, right? And so it's a different kind of ideological challenge and one that's much harder to just crack down on in certain ways because it's kind of wrapping itself in some of the same language and symbols and narratives. I think this goes back to the American case of, you know, there's this great book about the FBI in the 1960s by David Cunningham called There's Something Happening Here, reference the Buffalo Springfield song. It argues the FBI has no idea what in God's name to do with the New Left and the Black Panthers. It like doesn't understand that they're fundamentally alien. The KKK it doesn't like, but like it kind of gets it, right? As you see these very like much more fine-grained understanding of the KKK because they're kind of like, they're within something approximating what the FBI can understand, whereas these outside radically anti-systemic forces are just like, what are you people, right? Like yippies and Abby Hoffman and these straight-laced FBI agents are totally baffled. So that's like anti-extra systemic, and in a sense it's easier just to say these are outsiders who need to be repressed. Whereas people who are at least nominally insiders, right, that's a very different kind of political challenge.
Would you have something to say on Trump's relationship with the right wing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a...
How do you...
So
what is
I
the
would think...
implication of your argument for that?
Well, it's not good. It's that like there's a lot of wink, wink, nod, nod because a lot of these folks are explicitly pro-Trump and argue that they're real authentic Americans, right? Unlike all these kind of lefty, woke, anti-American whatevers, right? So it doesn't surprise me that things like January 6th happen or that, you know, you've seen upsurges in threats against election officials with...
And it's not straining bet though, it's a willing bet though.
Yeah, well that's, I mean, these are, right, that's the problem. That I mean, I don't want to overstate it, right? But it's a serious problem, I think, that you get a movement, kind of this Trump movement that talks in a language of force and violence and authenticity, right? It's kind of an almost ethno-nationalist movement, right?
Does it automatically gravitate towards a Confederate position and say, without saying so, and say,
I don't know.
And make the case that that is true Americanism?
Like Confederacy as in the
Yeah,
Confederate
so,
States?
Anti-black, anti...
Oh,
it can't be slavery cannot be the issue anymore, but race
Right.
will be, right? Race.
So, yeah, something about, I mean, obviously race, right, and foreignness and indigeneity in that sense of like, you know, us Americans have been here for a lot of generations, as opposed to immigrants, people, you know, who didn't come over a long time ago. These hyphenated new Americans are not as truly American as we are, right? I don't want to go too far with the Confederate example because I just reread Richard Bensel's book Yankee Leviathan. And the Confederacy is a whole different kettle of fish in certain ways, but certainly questions about race, belonging, hierarchy, right? What are the boundaries of the polity and what are the hierarchies within it? right, is a question that's in this book, I think is very relevant to the Trump phenomenon. Who are we? And among us who are first-class citizens and who are kind of people who better keep their mouth shut because they're actually really guests here, right? That's how I interpret a lot of what Trumpism is. But that also may be totally wrong.
But there's a sense in which Trump's affection for American South is very evident.
Yes, but I don't think it's reducible to the South. I think it's a broader set, like, you know, my uncle in Nevada,
Yeah. He's a Trump supporter.
child of immigrants from Italy, lives in rural Western Nevada, right? It's not like the South qua the South, but it's kind of like toughness, resolve, Americanness, right? So, yeah. So there's overlap for sure, but I wouldn't reduce it to the South.
Connor, you have a question?
Yes.
Yeah, Connor, and then let's do 2 questions now, yeah? Connor.
Yeah, thank you again, Paul, for this great presentation. I guess my question is, how do armed groups kind of render themselves legible to the state in terms of signaling this ideological component that's important, right? And
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, does the type of violence that armed groups engage in, and again, I don't want to hammer you over the head with sort of the micro dynamics picture, but just thinking through, especially in the context of, say, vigilante politics and vigilante violence, does the type of violence vis-a-vis, say, civilians matter in this picture?
Probably it does. It's not part of my story, but I think probably it does. You know, very dramatic forms of targeting of civilians probably signal something different. I don't think it's quite that simple because I think there are ways of targeting that then kind of can be justified, perhaps, in a way that might seem more or less palatable, but I think in general there's probably some correlation or some relationship between more aggressive targeting and the signaling of more aggressive war aims. So, yes, probably. That probably doesn't get you enough, you know, in general to get there. I mean, I will, okay, so let me walk that back just a little bit. So there are cases in which state forces are targeted pretty aggressively, but still seen as like kind of manageable actors. So the Naga groups are blowing up trains in the late 1960s and like really going after Indian security forces, and they're getting Chinese aid. And yet it's like, yeah, we can figure out a way to deal with these people, right? Those don't automatically trigger like, you know, mass mobilization and crackdowns, but sure, I think there's probably a broad relationship between those two things.
Yeah, my question was largely on Dr. Narang's point, which kind of brought up this notion of like the Congress being different from the BJP when thinking about how the state behaves with non-state actors. I'd love to kind of hear about if you think there are any relevant differences between the two. I mean, one could imagine that, for instance, in the Northeast, maybe there's like different willingness to incorporate other ethnic identities into the Indian state.
Yeah.
And different willingnesses to engage with organizations like the Yuva Bahini and UP, which has been a different kind of non-state actor.
So I think absolutely on the second part. I think kind of what we might think of as Hindu-Muslim relations and kind of mainland India absolutely are affected by the rise of the BJP. That's not the primary focus of the book for various reasons, but I think that if I'm looking for a prediction of a change, it would be that. I think the Congress and the BJP in certain ways, right, are quite similar when it comes to some of these counterinsurgency conflicts, actually. I think part of this is the Northeast is just seen as a peripheral place apart that kind of isn't plugging into these kind of core cleavages, and the BJP has actually been very flexible in the Northeast. They're like, yeah, sure, you want to do business with all, like, we can do that. So in that sense, there's been enormous continuity, I would say, in policy in the Northeast over decades now. And violence just keeps going down, more and more ceasefires emerge in ways that are very different than, so in Kashmir, both the Congress and BJP want Kashmir, right? It's central for somewhat different reasons in somewhat different ways. You know, there's been an escalated crackdown since 2019, but that, you know,
Is that
I mean,
the cyclical variation, or is that sort of
I think it's more cyclical. I mean, there's some political stuff, but you know, Congress in 1990s Kashmir was
pretty bad?
yeah. So I don't think there's a huge difference on some of these counterinsurgency specific questions, right? Same with the Maoist conflict. We haven't seen massive shifts in counterinsurgency strategy, in part because like neither of them especially like the Maoists. Neither of them also think they're, you know, worth an enormous amount of political, economic attention, right? Like they're to be managed.
I'm curious in the Northeast, is your sense that, and maybe you don't, maybe this wasn't part of the scope of the work, but is there a sense that political voters on the ground view the Congress and the BJP very similarly as a powerful national?
I don't know. That's a good question, but I don't know the answer to that. There's some really good reporters on the Northeast who have been covering those campaigns, but I honestly don't know the answer.
This does connect you to what Megan was asking, citing Catherine Boone.
Yep.
Why can't we say, and I may be wrong here, but just tell me why I'm wrong. why can't we say that Northeast is like this hugely unproductive part of India? I can't say this in front of everyone.
Don't say that to
but in
someone
academics-
someone from
in
1970.
academics- But that's not true.
We're live streaming. We're on Twitch or something.
No,
I know.
It
I
can be
know.
perceived. I'm not saying that.
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
Delhi
One could
can
say.
perceive. I'm not saying that. Delhi can perceive. Delhi can perceive when it compares
Sure.
Punjab or Kashmir
Yeah.
to the Northeast. Then the Catherine Moon metaphor might be
So-
a rival explanation.
So
I'm not
it's
saying
so I
necessarily
mean
right.
I think an Assamese nationalist looking at what's happening to Assam's natural resource in the 1970s might disagree with you, right? And so the narrative in the Northeast is that Delhi sucks up all of the hydro and other resources in the Northeast,
Right.
and it's exploitative, right? This is Myron Wiener's Sons of the Soil. So I would certainly say the view from the Northeast may be radically different. Number one. Number two, I think in comparative perspective, we have plenty of cases in which armed groups are targeted very aggressively in areas of kind of marginal economic importance, right? I mean, and the reverse. So Karachi is Pakistan's economic hub, and at various points the MQM was given something like free rein by either provincial or national governments. Conversely, Baluchistan is not, the industrial heartland, right? And yet we've seen very hardline, catch and kill, disappearances, very intense counterinsurgency at various points out there that don't seem to be driven by some kind of pure resource-based logic. So I would never say that in a particular case or set of cases these concerns are not what's going on. But I would be uncomfortable kind of saying that this is now our master variable instead. Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
And just briefly, it seems that like the northwest of Pakistan and Kashmir is similarly kind of like thorns into the ethnic makeup of either country, respectively. Not ethnic, religious makeup.
The northwest of Pakistan.
Or like
Which
the-
is the frontier province, the
the
Khyber
frontier
Pakhtunkhwa.
provinces.
No, but what is the similarity to Kashmir in terms of religious
Well, see, my
challenges?
understanding vaguely from Ashu's course is that there's historically been a separatist.
Oh, yeah, there's been
from the
Pashtun
northwest
separatism.
frontier province.
Never accepted Durand line.
Yeah, though, so kind of Pashtun separatism definitely, or
I mean-
Pashtun nationalism, let me be more specific, because separatism is a different thing, yeah, certainly exists. And the Pakistani state is not especially like the PTM movement that's emergent in Pashtun areas either, right? So,
I mean, there has been historically a political current in the frontier province, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which wanted union with the Pashtuns of Afghanistan.
some, yeah.
I mean, it goes back for a very long time. And just, up and down, but that has been, that is one of the reasons, this is something Fotini knows much more than I do, because she spent so much time in Afghanistan. But from the literature, it seems the two Pashto sides of the Durand line have often had the desire to
Yeah,
unite.
right, which has not been something that central elites have been very interested in.
Right. Well, it's time to thank. I'll tell you what absolutely stood out for me. I was sharing. I was not the commentator. The idea that India feels threatened by religious militancy and not by linguistic militancy. Pakistan is threatened by ethno-linguistic militancy, but not by religious militancy. You can clearly see that what is Pakistan threatened most by? Bangladesh or East Pakistan. And now Balochistan, or if something develops in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, it won't be the religious militants per se. Right? In India's case, similarly, whenever a state has rebelled on linguistic grounds, it has been managed. It is the religious militancy in India, and that's completely inserted into the foundational narrative. Similarly, when Sinhala-only policy emerges in Sri Lanka in 1956, after that, the idea that Tamils and Sinhala people can come together, it just becomes more and more and more impossible. As that line goes, which says that this land belongs only to Sinhala Buddhist people. Who are you, Tamil people? You are not part of the grand narrative, the master narrative of this country. And this book does a tremendously good job of getting to those foundational issues of politics. Of course, we'll have to figure out how this macro hits the macro. And there, I think tactical issues will be very important, as has been pointed out again and again. So thank you very much, Paul, for giving us so much food for thought.